Welcome to part 3 of the Genesis story. I've entitled this Life on Earth with a subtitle of God's Ideal. And we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 2 starting at verse 4 and to the end of the chapter. Let's look back at chapter 1 and the first verse or 2 of chapter 2. The author here has pictured God in this way. God has created order out of nothing. And there are divine patterns in the way this world works. Humans have a task. We're responsible to God for looking after his world. The picture is of humans being the apex of God's creation, and God making the world for our benefit and support. We reflect God, image and likeness, in what we do and in what we are. And the world is described as very good, totally fit for purpose. Looking at it another way, we can see this under 7 headings. There's a clear sequence of ordering the world, filling it with life. God is on his own, and very different from the other stories where many gods are mentioned. Life has its own reproductive process. It doesn't depend on particular gods allowing it to happen. The idea of the image, the likeness of God, applying to all humans, men and women. And in the cultivation of the land, we're not dependent on some particular local deity. Animals and plants reproduce naturally. And against other accounts, God's not fighting the sea. He created it, and he controls it. And again, unlike other accounts, the sun, moon and the stars are not deities to be worshipped. Very important message today when we have all the astrology flying around in our newspapers and media. The sun, the moon and the stars are simply created entities, and they have no control whatsoever over our lives and our destinies. That's the picture of chapter 1. I mentioned in the first presentation the way that the writer has structured the book in such a systematic and organised way. There are these 10 sections. Each of them starts with a phrase like this, varying from version to version. This is the account of, the history of, the family history of. And in the Hebrew, it's just 2 words. And it's a series of stories, because the story was the way at that time that great truths were communicated. And so the book is structured in terms of stories, each starting with this introduction. And we're going to be looking at the first story. This is the account of the heavens and the earth. So let's start at Genesis chapter 2:4. Here we see the phrase, this is the account of. Now it became a fashion at the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century for people to suggest that this was a second creation account written by a different author, which some editor had tacked on to chapter 1. This kind of approach has been researched much since then, and it's shown not to be particularly helpful. So there was the idea of 2 creation accounts. Much of this was just based on speculation and human opinion. The basis of it largely depended on chapter 1 using Elohim, the word for God. It's a plural word, the word for God. And chapter 2 using Yahweh Elohim, a composite of 2 words for God. And people suggested there were 2 authors. It isn't necessarily the case. There are many other explanations for this change of language, and we'll look at them in a moment. Let's look at Genesis chapter 1, and remember that goes up to the 3rd verse of Genesis chapter 2, and then the rest of Genesis chapter 2. We could describe that as a kind of overall picture. God brings order out of disorder, and he fills the emptiness of the world with life forms. Chapter 2 describes the events that took place in the order that God had created. They're not parallel creation accounts, they've got a totally different purpose, and looking at them it becomes very clear. Here, humanity is the peak of creation, but this pictures humanity within that creation. That might be called a cosmological account, while this one, an anthropological account, centered on man, humanity, men and women. And it makes complete sense that way, and in the light of that, the different uses of the word God in the Hebrew make a lot of sense. Chapter 2 is set in the area of Mesopotamia. There's a map. The two famous rivers, the Gulf just at the bottom right-hand corner. The area shaded in the light buff colour, surrounded by the pale pink, that is the area of Mesopotamia. So the story is set in that area, a dry land, dependent on the water from the rivers that flowed through the land. By human effort, crops can be grown as fertile. There's a picture of 4 rivers flowing symbolically out of the Garden of Eden. 2 rivers are identifiable, the Euphrates and the Tigris, but 2, we don't know where they are. But we've got to remember, thousands of years have passed, and rivers have moved. Climate has changed. So it's perfectly possible that the rivers don't exist today. And we have a picture of a paradise for human life. We're a long way back. That's the time, roughly, when the book was written. There's quite a lot of evidence from research that confirms the general picture the Genesis author has painted. This is where agriculture started in Europe and Asia. That is known. And round about 10,000 BC, the climate changes that took place a bit after the Ice Age was completed made all of this possible. And this is where in the world people started to settle in small communities. And later on in Genesis we'll see mention of these small communities. It all fits together. It does make sense. The evidence is consistent. And we have to look at evidence all the time in understanding and interpreting what the author is saying. Now let's move to Genesis 2 and 7. This is a famous verse. The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. A picture with very, very deep meaning. Yahweh Elohim for God. You see, the focus here is on man in relation to God, and Yahweh is the right word for God in the Hebrew language, which has that emphasis. Elohim, the great sovereign Lord, the Creator. Yahweh, the covenant God, the self-existent one. And we can see why the author has changed the words. That's not created, that's formed. In the first presentation, I drew attention to 3 words that the author uses. That word speaks of deliberate, purposeful reshaping, taking something that is there and making something from it, not creating out of nothing. The word for man was Adam, and it's again a lovely play on words. Adam, Adama. The writer has used the subtleties of language in the original with great care. Let's look at further things in this verse. Human beings are a combination, a partnership is the word I've used, between the material and the spiritual. If you take our human bodies and analyse them right down, we're made of exactly the same chemical materials as the rest of the world. It's all been done. We know exactly the proportion of the elements, the chemical elements, that constitute a human being. We're made from the same dust of the ground, the same material of the world around. But we're also spiritual. We fast forward to the times of the Greeks. The Greeks thought of human beings being characterized by the ability to reason. That's what made a human being a human being. That was the way they looked at it. In our modern thought today, perhaps the characterization of a human being is someone who's got freedom and creativity. And that's a kind of modern way of looking at it. Now, both are true, at least in part. But the author to Genesis pictures something better. You see, reason isn't what characterizes a human being. It's just a tool that we human beings have because our brains have developed to enable us to do it. But it's allowing us to control the choice, which is part of freedom and creativity. Because at a deeper level, we have a dual nature. We're both physical and spiritual. You can't chop open a human being to find the spiritual because the spiritual has no physical substance. But there is within human beings, all of us, a sense of that which is beyond us, that which is of the divine, that which is of the spirit. All human beings have this. In every culture throughout the world, many people have studied this and written on it. We have this sense always of something beyond ourselves. And that's the picture that the author of Genesis has got, and it underpins reason, it underpins creativity, it underpins choice. It's more fundamental. Too often today in our society that's ignored. But that's fundamental to our very nature and existence. It's interesting that it's breath of lives, plural. Nobody seems to quite know why, but it does raise interesting questions that there's greater depth and subtlety in this chapter. It's also interesting that lives and living come from the same root, which has eventually been translated as Eve. Again, it's ordinary Hebrew words, and we put capital letters on them at times, but they have a deep underlying meaning. That's a very important principle. We become fully human. We fulfill our full destiny when we're spiritually alive. That's the picture that the author of Genesis is painting here. And you may have found the truth of that in your own life. We truly become human when we're spiritually alive. We become spiritually alive when we have a relationship with the great Spirit God who made the universe. Literally in the Hebrew, it says human to person becomes. We become spiritually alive. We fulfill our destiny. We move from being a physical being to a full person. There's so much in this verse of depth. The author, in just a few words, has captured a depth of meaning that is breathtaking. Putting the two verses together, we saw in the last presentation humans created by God, outwardly in what we do, inwardly in what we are. And there's the hint in the original language of that. And the picture is worked out in Genesis. You see, we are outwardly like God because we're looking after God's world. We do what He does, what He wants us to do. We have the creativity, the freedom, and inwardly, because we're capable of spiritual response. That's what makes us fully human. And the two ideas tie together beautifully. Genesis chapter 2 expanding on Genesis chapter 1. I dropped that in from a height. And as the dust settles, that's a very important statement. That's what the author of Genesis is saying, deep hidden within the text. That's our true humanity. That's our true fulfillment. That's our true destiny. What a glorious picture. Let's move on quickly to the Garden of Eden. Now remember, Eden is just an ordinary Hebrew word. The translators have put it with a capital E. And for good reasons. A paradise. And a picture of an early couple. And all the context speaks of the land of Mesopotamia. And all the symbolism speaks of all God's goodness to humanity. God's ideal, God's purpose. But I don't know where it is. And indeed the geography is unclear. The land has changed over the millennia. And the details are sparse. There are people who've tried to work it out. It's just speculation. Perhaps we're never meant to work it out. But I'm going to suggest the meaning is very, very rich in this story. Let's look at that rich meaning. The great principle. This world, of itself, tended by human beings, life is possible, and there's the provision of food and water. The world of Mesopotamia was the only world that the author knew. People didn't travel. And that world was a dusty world where the rivers and the water that came from them, the water of life, determined life. And all the symbolism of water and human settlements became possible, and this is where it started. God's provision, but there's human responsibility within that provision. And here's a great principle that the writer is establishing. God provides, but there are boundary conditions. There's a richness in the world, but it's our responsibility to cultivate and look after the garden. And that still is our responsibility for human beings in the world today, to look after God's world. And it's all there for us, except the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we'll have to look at what that is meaning. See, we can do that, but that's better. But that important principle is established here. Freedom is not a free-for-all. This is one of the misunderstandings of our society today, where sometimes people conceptualize freedom. I can do what I like. I will run my life. I will take my decisions. And that statement has got depth in it and summarizes what the author is saying. You see, that self-willed independence is a kind of slavery. We become the center, and the center, which is us, determines what we do. That's not true freedom. It's a strange paradox. Let me give you a picture to illustrate this. A picture of a family, idyllic family scene, a lovely family scene. These children have security and freedom. But you see, the real freedom of these young people comes from accepting the family boundary conditions. The parents have set the conditions. That gives security. Every child needs the boundary conditions, usually established about the second year of life. And if we don't establish them, they don't have security, and they don't really have freedom. And with the security and the freedom that comes from working within the boundary conditions, the child can move into the world to face anything. That's true freedom. It's not a free-for-all. It's a rejection of self-willed independence. Watch the 2- and 3-year-old child. They don't have the boundary conditions. You see their slavery to self-willed independence. And they drive their parents and those around them completely crazy by their behavior. Freedom is not a free-for-all. Let's look at the trees. Trees in general are symbols of life. If you look at Psalm 1, you'll see the picture given quite clearly there. The tree of life is identified later in Genesis as symbolizing immortality. But what's the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Nowhere else in the Bible is it mentioned. Now, if we look at other literature, the phrase good and evil gives us the clue because it's used in a kind of specific way. It's used in a sense of legal responsibility. Quoting someone else that I can't remember whom, so I do apologise, it's setting oneself up as one's own judge of what is right and wrong. Now that would be how the phrase would be understood by the people at that time. And it gives us the clue as to what it means today. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I've called it moral autonomy. Let's unpack both of these a little bit further. Immortality. That is the spiritual destiny for humanity. That's what God's intention. I am not talking about living physically on earth forever. I'm talking about immortality in the sense of the New Testament, with a resurrected body. And although we're jumping the gun slightly, in leaving God's paradise, that guarantee was lost. Access to the tree of life was no longer there, had to be won back. Now let's move to the right, to moral autonomy, deciding what is right and wrong. And what God is saying, what the author is revealing here is that this is not something that we should have. We don't know enough. We're not wise enough. Only God knows. And that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Great symbolism, great depth here. Ponder this. Work it out and come to your conclusions about the meaning of this. I've pictured it this way, and I've turned them round simply to make the graphics work. The knowledge of the good and evil confers autonomy. We decide what we want to do. We know what's right and wrong. Well, we don't. The tree of life conferring immortality in that spiritual physical sense and the resurrected body sense, the New Testament sense. You see, that leads to an independence from the Creator. It breaks the trustful relationship. We're no longer dependent on God. I'll do it my way. And we leave God out of the equation. We've lost it. But the immortality, a life which goes on forever in a resurrected body. Now, it's not life continuing what's here on earth at the moment. Can't develop that any further within the time limits of this presentation. Men and women, a wonderfully meaningful story. Let me just pick out some of the key points of this story. Incomplete without a partner. Now, I've got to put a small caveat on this. We're talking about a culture and a society and a context which is not Western, and it is very, very different. But that's God's ideal. That word there, it's the idea of someone who can make a task possible. Together, male and female, the task of the wonder of life is possible. Complementarity. Now, we know men and women are not the same. We complement each other. That's just symbolism for humanity's responsibility for God's created world. The symbolism of this, the woman standing alongside the man, a partner support, complementing, each needing the other, naming the woman Again, the symbolism of taking responsibility. That's a beautiful picture. Now, a theologian of a long time ago wrote this, and I quite liked it. The woman not made out of his head to top him, not out of his feet to be trampled upon by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, under his arm to be protected, near his heart to be beloved. Old-fashioned language maybe, but I think it's captured something of what the Genesis author is revealing here. Equality, working together, complementarity. What a beautiful picture. And it saddens me when I look out in the world, particularly the religious world, to see how often we've lost this. God's ideal? Again, we're familiar with this verse. In the culture of the day, the man took responsibility towards his parents, and rightly so. Now he has a higher responsibility towards his wife. See this in the context of the time where the woman would leave her family house to join her husband's family house. And the man would have responsibility toward his parents. He'd still be living with them, and his wife. But he's no longer having his responsibility to his parents as the dominant one. Now his wife takes top slot. Very strong language there. I've translated it glued together. Total commitment. Not easy to prize apart. Sharing the deepest intimacy and nothing hidden one from the other. Now just stop and ponder this as a picture of marriage. Ideal? Yes, it's God's ideal. Beautiful? Yes, because that's the way God intended it to be. We find our true fulfillment in our spiritual nature. There's a leaving, a united, and a one flesh. A change in responsibilities, a formal relationship glued together. And their sexual fulfillment is within a permanent commitment relationship. A beautiful and wonderful picture that we so often in our society today fall so far short of. But that's God's plan and purpose. Let me stop for a moment and look at this word Adam. It's used a lot of times. And translated, don't take the numbers too exactly because it will vary slightly from version to version, but I don't think that'll be far off in any of the Bible versions we use. It's an ordinary word. The translators in one or two places have chosen to put a capital letter on it and identify it as a person. And I counseled before that we've got to be cautious. The translators have done it with extreme care and a lot of wisdom. They haven't just done it randomly. But where does it start? Usually the first time we meet the capital letter, and it's just the same ordinary word, is in verse 20. And it all goes back to the Geneva Bible of 1560. The first major translation to hit the English-speaking world. Extremely popular with the ordinary people. Let's stop for a moment. The so-called authorized version came a long time after that in 1611. 75% of the authorized version is identical to the Geneva Bible. And the authorized version was authorized by King James, the 6th of Scotland and the 1st of England. Authorized to be used in churches in his realms. That's the only meaning of the word authorized. It's nothing something special. He wanted it to replace the Geneva Bible. It took about 50, 70 years for the replacement to take place. People liked the Geneva Bible. But both Bibles are written in Old Language. But that's where the first use of the proper name comes from, and it's come into our modern translations by use and wont from this. Just be careful. Let's be cautious. Could be translated either way. Bringing it together, humans within God's creation, God's ideal pattern. It's set in the context of a story, because that's how they communicated in those days, in a day when there wasn't the ability to read and write. The couple. The dual nature of humanity that is so true. Our responsibilities as humans to look after God's word. The boundary conditions to do it God's way, not my way. God provides, we cooperate in looking after his world, and it's a wonderful world. The goal for humanity was immortality in a resurrected body. In this world, the complementarity of nature of man and wife, and the nature and commitment of marriage, the bedrock of society, sadly undermined today. That's the picture the Genesis author is painting for us. But we move on to presentation 4, when we see the effects of human rebellion. We didn't cooperate with God's ideal, and there were problems.